Hi, my name is Mike. I'm a professor for social work management, and you are listening to Managing Around, the bi-weekly podcast about social science, culture, and management. Managing Around is part of the Talk About Organizations podcast network, a community resource and discussion platform for key ideas in management and organization studies, which is supported by our listeners.
In this episode, we will discuss the topic of 5 theses for the further development of SoTL in higher education teaching. SoTL stands for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and it is a movement that aims to enhance the quality and impact of teaching and learning in higher education. And this is done through research and evidence-based practices. Based on a recently published article by the host of this podcast and his colleagues from the German-speaking SoTL-Netzwork, Nerea, Vöing and Sabine Reisas, I will present and explain the 5 theses that can support a stronger integration, promotion and sustainable development of SoTL in higher education teaching and even beyond. These theses are based on the research-oriented approach of SoTL and have an impulsive character. The theses address different perspectives: quality development, transdisciplinary collaboration, internationalization, interinstitutional cooperation, and networking and community building. Stay tuned for an insightful and engaging conversation about SoTL in higher education teaching. Let's start with the first question. What is SoTL? SoTL stands for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and it is a scholarly tradition that involves instructors systematically investigating their own teaching, and especially its effects on students' learning. SoTL is based on the idea that teaching is not only a craft, but also a subject of inquiry that can be improved through research and evidence-based practices. Scholars share their findings with others through peer-reviewed publications or presentations so that they can contribute to the collective knowledge and improvement of teaching and learning in higher education. And also the discussion of the 5 theses for the SoTL development in this podcast today is a contribution to the community. Let's move to the main part of this episode today, the 5 theses for the SoTL development. I will first introduce each of the 5 theses and then explain how this can contribute to further development. Let's start with the first thesis. The SoTL approach is highly relevant for the innovative further development and quality assurance of higher education teaching. This means SoTL can help instructors improve their teaching practices, respond to changing demands and conditions, and develop their professional and disciplinary competence. SoTL is a way of questioning, analyzing, and reflecting on one's own teaching using research methods and evidence. SoTL can also foster a reflective and critical attitude towards the diversity and power relations in the classroom. Second thesis, the exploration of one's own teaching promotes a subject and teaching-related knowledge transfer between teachers, departments, and disciplines. SoTL can facilitate, in this sense, the integration of new research findings into teaching practices and how different disciplines can learn from each other's research cultures and methods. SoTL can enable a two-way transfer of knowledge between research and teaching, as well as a cross-disciplinary exchange of best practices and challenges. SoTL can also help instructors to identify and overcome the bottlenecks that hinder students' learning in their fields. Thesis 3. SoTL is a driver for an international network development of higher education teaching. SoTL has grown as a global movement since the 1990s, with various associations, conferences, and initiatives in different countries and regions. SoTL can also enhance the legitimacy and leadership of its practitioners who act as brokers between disciplines and cultures. SoTL can create opportunities for cross-border collaborations and exchange, such as the digital SoTL tour that takes place in the German-speaking university context. Thesis 4. SoTL creates opportunities for cross-disciplinary, cross-institutional and cross-status group communication about the development of good teaching. Findings from SoTL projects are shared with the public through different channels and formats, such as online journals that publish SoTL articles from different German universities and centers, such as the HINT journal from the University of Heidelberg, the Journal for Higher Education and Academic Development from the Higher Education Institute in Saxony, and die Hochschullehre from the publishing house WPV Media. Any dissemination of SoTL project results can enhance the cross-disciplinary, cross-institutional and cross-status group dialogue about good teaching. Thesis 5. Networks help to anchor SoTL in different disciplines. SoTL communities of practice can support the development and dissemination of SoTL findings, especially for those who are new to SoTL or come from different disciplines and institutions. As examples, I want to mention the EuroSoTL 2022 conference, where these issues were addressed, and the German-speaking SoTL-Netzwork, which was funded in 2017 based on this understanding. Let's conclude this episode today with the lessons. We have argued that SoTL is a key issue and challenge for educational sciences, higher education didactics and disciplinary didactics, as it enables a research-based and reflective approach to teaching and learning in higher education. SoTL can also enhance the professional development of instructors, the quality and impact of the student learning, and the inter- and transdisciplinary communication about good teaching. Based on the 5 theses mentioned before, we propose some ways to support a stronger integration, promotion, and sustainable development of SoTL in higher education teaching and even beyond. We also want to invite further discussion and collaboration based on this framework and encourage you to focus on topics such as students' involvement, discipline-specific teaching scenarios, knowledge and experience exchange, and cross-domain communities of practice. I hope that today's episode will inspire more instructors, maybe also you, to engage in SoTL and contribute to its advancement in higher education. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. Managing Around, the bi-weekly podcast about social science, culture, and management. Managing Around is part of the Talk About Organizations podcast network, a community resource and discussion platform for key ideas in management and organization studies, which is supported by our listeners. If you liked this episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast website. There's also a link in the show notes. If you've got any thoughts on this episode, or if you've got any idea about new podcast topics or questions you'd like to discuss, send me an audio file or voice note to hi@profmanagement.de. For any non-audio comments, drop a tweet or DM to @profmanagement on Twitter or Instagram, please. For more information, visit my website www.profmanagement.de. Thank you for listening and see you next time.